All right, let's get into one of the wildest, most enduring legends of the 20th century. We're talking about a story that has everything: secret wartime science, terrifying consequences, and yes, a naval warship that supposedly just vanished into thin air. I mean, think about it. The claim is so outrageous, it sounds like it's straight out of a sci-fi movie. But for more than 80 years, the story of the Philadelphia experiment, well, it's just refused to die. And this is the ship at the center of it all, the USS Eldridge. On the surface, just a regular WW-2 destroyer escort. But if the legend is to be believed, this ship was the focus of an experiment that literally tore a hole in the fabric of reality. So what exactly is the story? Let's unpack the legend piece by incredible piece, and you can see for yourself just how wild it gets. Okay, picture this. It's 1943, right in the thick of World War II. The U.S. Navy is scrambling for any advantage it can get, especially to protect its ships from enemy torpedoes and mines. The legend says that on this day, at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, they took things way too far. The story goes that huge generators on the Eldridge were fired up, and people supposedly saw this bizarre greenish fog start to swirl around the ship. And then, poof! The entire 1,200-ton warship became completely invisible, leaving nothing but its wake in the water. But if you think that's wild, it gets even crazier. Invisibility was apparently just the start. The story escalates, claiming the Eldridge didn't just turn invisible, it teleported. For a few minutes, it was supposedly spotted hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, before blinking out of existence again and reappearing right back in Philadelphia. And this is where the legend takes a really dark, horrifying turn. This wasn't some clean, successful experiment. The story claims it was a total disaster for the crew. Sailors were said to have gone completely mad, suffered horrific burns, and, well, some were supposedly found physically fused into the steel of the ship itself. Others, the story says, just vanished and were never seen again. So you hear all that: invisibility, teleportation, guys' views to the walls. You have to ask, where in the world did a story like this even come from? Is there any truth to it at all? To figure that out, we have to trace it back to its source. You know, for a story this huge, with books, movies, the whole shebang, you'd think there would be tons of sources. But nope, this entire elaborate legend can be traced back to just one person, and a couple of really strange letters. So here's how it all got started. Back in the mid-50s, an author named Morris Jessup, who wrote about UFOs, started getting these weird letters from a guy who called himself Carlos Miguel Allende. These letters, and then a copy of Jessup's own book that was sent to the Navy with all sorts of bizarre notes scribbled in it, laid out the whole incredible story for the very first time. And this was the man who started it all, Carlos Allende. His real name was Carl Allen, was a merchant marine, and he was adamant that he saw the whole thing happen. He was the sole eyewitness. And this is maybe the most important part of the whole puzzle. There were no other witnesses. No leaked government files, not a single other person came forward. The entire story rests on the claims of this one man, Carl Allen, who said he watched it happen from the deck of his ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth. Okay, so if you're an investigator and you've got this one single eyewitness, what's the first thing you do? You check the official records. If the ships were where Allen said they were, this would be the biggest story of the century. But if they weren't, well, the whole thing falls apart. So what does the Navy say? For decades, their position has been exactly the same, totally unwavering. They've searched their archives again and again, and they maintain that no experiment like this ever happened. But the real smoking gun, the thing that blows the whole story out of the water, is the official ship's logs. These are the meticulous, day-by-day records of where these ships were, and they tell a completely different story. On the day of the so-called experiment, the USS Eldridge wasn't even in Philadelphia. It was in New York, or maybe even in the Bahamas. And Carl Allen's ship, the Andrew Furuseth, it was on the other side of the planet, in the Mediterranean Sea. So the conclusion is pretty clear, right? I mean, for Allen to have seen anything, the two ships needed to be in the same harbor. The records prove they weren't even on the same continent. It's just physically impossible. All right, so if the timeline is impossible, then where did Allen even get this idea? Is it possible there was a tiny little grain of truth in there somewhere, a real experiment that he just misunderstood? Well, here's the most plausible answer. The legend is all about making a ship invisible. And believe it or not, the Navy was working on a technology to make ships invisible, just not invisible to the human eye. They were trying to make them invisible to magnetic mines. The real technology was called degaussing. Basically, they'd wrap these huge electrical cables around a ship's hull, run a current through them, and it would cancel out the ship's magnetic signature. It was a genius, life-saving piece of tech, but it had zero to do with teleportation or making a ship physically disappear. You can see how a sailor's rumor about making a ship invisible to mines could get twisted into something much more fantastic. And what about all the other weird details? That mysterious greenish glow? It was likely something called St. Elmo's fire, which is a totally normal weather phenomenon at sea. And the teleportation between Philly and Norfolk? Well, the Navy used a system of inland canals to move ships quickly and secretly. They could make that trip in just a few hours, which would have seemed impossibly fast to anyone who had to take the long route out on the open ocean. So, what do we have? A story from one man that's completely contradicted by official records, and we have pretty simple real-world explanations for almost every strange part of the legend. So how in the world did this hoax become one of the most famous paranormal stories of all time? Well, it's kind of like a textbook case of how a modern myth is born. It starts with one imaginative story. Then, that story gets picked up by people writing books about mysteries and the unexplained. Then a blockbuster book makes it a national sensation. And finally, Hollywood comes along and makes a movie, which just cements it in pop culture forever. And just to put a final pin in it, the facts have never changed. The Navy denies it, the ship's logs disprove it, and get this, in 1999, the actual veterans who served on the USS Eldridge held a reunion. They confirmed to reporters that not only did the experiment never happen, their ship never even docked in Philadelphia, period. In the end, it really seems like the Philadelphia experiment is a classic case of a story that was just too good, or maybe too terrifying, to be true. All the evidence points to it being a hoax, probably built on a sailor's misunderstanding of real science. And yet, the ghost of the USS Eldridge just keeps on sailing through our